All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar and conversation centering on autism in the workplace. My name is Lou Orslin. I'm the Director of the Employer and Workplace Policy Team at the Office of Disability Employment Policy. But before we begin with the webinar, let me first mention an important housekeeping item. You can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if you do have any questions, please be sure to put them in the comment box and we'll answer them as soon as possible. So let's begin. During today's conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about autism, its impacts at the workplace, how companies are addressing these issues, and at the end, we plan to offer a few suggestions for how to put your passions to work in order to increase employment of people on the autism spectrum. To begin with, let's start with introductions. So I'm joined today with three experts who are really at the nexus of people on the autism spectrum and the workplace. Let me first introduce a colleague of mine, Dr. Scott Robertson. Dr. Robertson, an autistic adult, is a senior policy advisor with the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor. Scott serves as a federal project manager for the Partnership on Inclusive Apprenticeships. Dr. Robertson has a PhD in information science and technology from Penn State University. In our conversation today, we'll also be talking with Andy Traub, who serves as Vice President of Human Resources and Allied Inclusion Works at Allied Global Services. And also Lauren Steinbach, Director of Strategic Workforce Initiatives at Next for Autism. Lauren's responsible for implementing inclusive workplace strategies with corporate partners by creating pathways for hiring and retaining talent with disabilities and with autism. So as we begin today's presentation, let's start with a story. So Scott, could you talk for a few minutes about what your professional journey's been and what your life's really been like entering the workforce as a person on the spectrum?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you real well.
So thanks for the introduction. So as was shared, I'm an autistic adult, and I work currently at DOL at ODEP, and I've had many challenges and barriers in my life experience to tap my skills and talents on my career journey. And that included some challenges, not only going through school in terms of like K-12 and college, but also kind of finding my way after I completed my PhD. And I was very fortunate that in the federal government, we have Schedule A hiring. And I was able to come through and be hired through the Affirmative Action Hiring Authority they have with Schedule A, and interview direct with my first manager at ODEP, and then the team actually, and then joined ODEP relatively quickly, and then was able to tap some accommodations and supports that helped improve my performance and productivity as a person who learns differently because of my neurodivergent thinking and learning. And I can share more about some of these accommodations that I've used, like noise canceling headphones, et cetera, when we talk a little bit more about supports that can help empower people who are neurodivergent in the workplace, including autistic people.
Great, great. Hey, Scott, can you just talk a little bit about being an adult with autism and really what that experience has been like for you?
The experience of being an autistic person means that my brain thinks differently, learns differently, and processes information differently around the world when I'm interacting with people in different settings, and it means that sometimes I've had challenges, connecting with people in terms of like social relationships, making friends in my life, fitting in with social situations in terms of knowing nuance of situations where sometimes rules that aren't written down, et cetera, are fitting in are really challenging. And sometimes just like processing, planning, organizing, some of that doesn't come as naturally to me. And I've sometimes needed to learn coping strategies, compensatory strategies to help adapt myself. But on the other hand, the detailed thinking that I have, and some of the other strengths and talents that I have, some of which is because of my autism, helps give me, you know, great gifts and strengths that can really help empower my work and have really enhanced what I do for the work at ODEP.
Great. Hey, thanks so much for sharing your experience and starting us off today. Those insights, I think, are very helpful into this topic, so very grateful. Now, let's take a toll to gauge companies' commitment to talent on the autism spectrum. So our poll question is, is your company actively seeking out talent on the autism spectrum? So we'll give you a couple of minutes or a minute or so to vote there. So again, if you could answer that question, our poll question, is your company actively seeking out talent on the autism spectrum? All right, how are we doing with the votes?
We're good. I'll close it out in 5 seconds.
All right, great. I feel like I should be saying do 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 do.
Okay, here we go.
All right.
Wow,
So
almost 50-50.
this is a very interesting result. Yeah, 50-50. So hopefully the 50 who are engaged and actively seeking talent, you know, we're hoping that this certainly brings value to you, and then also to persuade others to really dip in and to really see what this is all about and create the kind of culture where people with neurodiversity, people who are on the autism spectrum can really feel a sense of belonging and be a productive member of your workforce. So that's great. So now let's start the conversation. We want to go to the next slide with Lauren. So can you tell us a little bit about autism in general?
Help if I take myself off mute. Sure. So I'm trying to figure out here. Okay, so we're going to talk about some facts about autism. So one thing I want to start with, and I always like to lead with, is that autism looks different from person to person. There are no two people that their autism looks identical. And it varies based off of their executive functioning skills, their communication and social interaction skills, and sensory processing. And so what that really means is that they might have difficulty organizing or planning or paying attention and prioritizing. But the benefit, and that's not for every single person with autism, but the benefit is the new perceptions, the new perspectives that they bring to the workforce. And we're going to talk about how companies are seeing the benefit to this more and more, and how the value of their new perspectives is really enhancing the workforce and the work culture as a whole. Let's talk really quickly about the diagnosis rate. So the diagnosis rate is 1 in 54 according to the CDC, and this is for diagnosis rate for children. We are seeing that does not include adults that are being diagnosed, but generally speaking, it's estimated that about 2% of our US population is on the autism spectrum. And so what that means is about 50,000 young adults are entering the workforce each year, which that's a very, very large number. And so businesses are definitely starting to see this is something that they can no longer ignore, and the number keeps increasing. And so they're really seeing that they're going to have to adapt to this new workforce coming in. And so what that means is that they might have to make sure that their policies and procedures are inclusive for people with autism. And that their culture is inclusive for the autistic talent as well. And so because of this, many companies are doing this. And so we'll talk about some of the strategies that these companies are using. But because of this, they're seeing that this talent, the autistic talent, are bringing some real value to the workforce. And we're going to talk about that as well, why it's so important to recruit, retain, and advance this top talent with autism. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here, but first we're going to talk next about how neurodiversity and autism can impact the workplace.
So one of the things about this slide, and you know, Lauren, as you're talking about, you know, the rate is increasing in diagnosis. I almost wanted to go back and kind of change the title of the slide. Not only is how is neurodiversity and autism impacting the workplace, but it's also, to your point earlier, it's like this is coming and this is going to be part of our workforce, and either we embrace autism in our workplace because it's coming, or we're going to be all recruiting in a very small pool of people. So, and that's going to be increasingly smaller. So what are some of the impacts of autism? Well, first of all, consumers who are, you know, our customers, and that could be a business to business or it could be direct consumer. They prefer to do business that employ people with disabilities. And that's right now you're talking 85 to 90% of consumers state that they will actually give their dollars and their loyalty to brands who are proactive in the disability recruiting. And it's not necessarily like we're quiet about it. It's like being bold and saying we are an employer who embraces diversity, and disability is one of those segments. Certainly tapping into the diverse skills and abilities and perspectives of autistic talent, you know, coupling with what Lauren has said earlier about it being a spectrum, and certainly hearing Scott's story, there's so much value that can be brought to companies. I've worked with a company that, you know, one of the things we did was we changed the way we engaged our consumers and measured our people. And one of the thoughts was, oh my gosh, the people who have, you know, neurodiversity or autism may be washed out, and suddenly it's like they were actually high performers. So that it's not a matter of assume things are going to happen. It's actually set the bar and let people, you know, race to that level. Product innovation, new perspectives. I'm just being able to see things differently. I always tell people it's more of we're looking through different eyes and different lenses at product and innovation, and our people allow them to pour into that, because honestly, it enriches your culture. And then attracting millennials and from, you know, another society-minded talent. Just on the recruiting space, you are going to start attracting that. People are, you know, the millennials and the new talent coming out of schools. And really what's happened over the past year is people become more society minded, and they are certainly interested in working with places where diversity is embraced, but also where autism is, you know, first and foremost, to where it's like, hey, you know, we're all neurodiverse in different ways. So. But how the question is how does this have an impact on the employees within the workspace itself? You know, we talked a little bit about, you know, the advantages to the workers, the expanded sense of community and having that community pride, being able to do well at work. You know, people, you know, there's an idea of I can do my community outreach on my personal time, but suddenly it's like, wait a second, I can actually have more of a sense of community at my workplace. I mean, we all spend 60+% of our time there. And so being able to have that sense of pride, self-confidence and self-esteem at work. Obviously the individuals with autism, but also the individuals who are working alongside the individual with autism. It's new, it's different. It requires a little bit of understanding, empathy, and quite frankly, just embracing the skills and diverse talent that we have working around us. People will find workers become more self-confident and self-esteem goes up again, and then enhanced performance and productivity when supported. The individuals with autism, depending on their skill set, just like we as talent recruiters all the time, we're looking for the right talent for the right jobs. You find somebody who really gets locked into what they do, and you will find their performance at times can actually outperform the incumbents on the, you know, a new worker can, you know, outperform the people that have been working there for a while. So, you know, I think there's just a lot of advantages, and certainly this in of itself can be a full hour slide. But considering that, I think, you know, we certainly do need to get on talking more about, you know, how do you embrace that with supporting people with autism in the workplace.
Great. Great, thanks very much, Andy. Really appreciate that. And you know, in this time of COVID, I think it's really best to have empathy and flexibility for all people, right? It's not just people with autism, not just people with disabilities. So everybody, I think we just have gained so much of a better sense of really how to manage people and how to manage people most effectively, and for them to be productive. But I think these, as you said, I think this is particularly true of people on the autism spectrum. So again, our mantra words for today, flexibility and empathy, right? Very, very important. So we know, Scott, that there are many benefits to having people with disabilities and people particularly on the autism spectrum in your workforce. And you know, we just heard from Andy a bit about that, but can you talk a little more about how companies are really addressing autism in the workplace?
Sure. Thank you for that, Lou. I find that there's great value in making sure folks can access the accommodations and supports they need to be successful, and that includes for autistic people like myself, where things like noise canceling headphones, executive coaching have been helpful to me. Sometimes having like fidget aids, I don't know if I can show it on camera, is like things that I can kind of squeeze, et cetera, that help me kind of reduce my anxiety and feel more comfortable with my work. And then sort of positive encouragement, flexibility, open-mindedness, and direct feedback from my supervisor has been really helpful for my performance and productivity. And when we think about supports kind of overall, we can think about, like, for instance, flexible talent entry points to help with hiring recruitment, where you focus more on the skills rather than just someone sort of impressing you from the social kind of standpoint in the interview. A lot of times historically, interviews often don't match socially what you actually do in the job. One of the greatest examples I heard of recently was like camera folks, where they do like some razzle and dazz in terms of like their personality or whatever in an interview, which has nothing to do with the ability to operate a camera. And I think we've seen that overall in terms of a new paradigm shift to be focusing more on skilled focused hiring. Universal design for workplaces, for instance, where you can adjust them to support multiple ways of thinking and learning, multiple ways of interaction, communicating, think explicitly about the sensory environment, the social environment, et cetera. Having training sessions that are focused not only on autism specifically and neurodiversity at work, but also on overall inclusion and empowerment for workers with and without disabilities and workers from other diverse and underrepresented backgrounds. Having employee resource groups can be really helpful, and we have, for instance, a guide for that over at earn.org. There's a toolkit folks can pull up on how to sustain and empower employee resource groups, or ERGs, and affinity groups. Often natural supports, and when we say natural supports, some supports that are already in the workplace, maybe folks are already helping each other kind of out, maybe there's already mentoring that happens, navigational type supports. A lot of times there are free supports that are already just happening, right, that can be really positive for empowering the workers' productivity. And this has been helpful for me, as sometimes just other coworkers who can sort of chip in and explain things explicitly and help with the scaffolding and structure on things that I may not understand for the norms that are going on. And then more inclusive work cultures can be really helpful for autistic people and other people with disabilities to have full inclusion to support success in the workplace, and that includes, for instance, social inclusion. And that may mean at times that there are some autistic people that may be so drained from the work during the day, may not be able to go to, you know, the after work party or some holiday kind of party. So maybe that's part of the adjustment accommodation process, is to allow for some flexibility in terms of what's essential socially and what may not be as essential for your workers. And then the process for actually requesting accommodations, folks may even need some scaffolding and structure to work through that, because that can be overwhelming at times. And employers should be thinking through how to innovate those processes for requesting accessible technology and accommodations to make sure that autistic people and other folks with disabilities can receive the supports and services that we need to be successful. And again, a lot of times these accommodations that can help empower us for success in our productivity and performance are really low cost, often just require a change in perspective or a change in paradigm. And when they do have cost, often in, for instance, in the hundreds of dollars is what the Job Accommodation Network, for instance, has found, askjan.org, which is another one of ODEP's TA centers. And so think about ways like this and other supports, you know, with the headphones and like fidget aids and things like that that are free, and then other things that may be a little bit of cost that can help empower folks to be successful.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate, again, those insights. So I think we have another poll.
We do. Let me launch it. All right, here we go.
All right, so I read the question. Are you aware of free workforce resources for employees on the autism spectrum? And again, are you aware of free workforce resources for employees on the autism spectrum?
All right, I think we can wrap it up. Let's go ahead and share the results.
All right. Okay. Well, that once again, this is good news. 67% of you all said no, and there are various resources out there, and 33 seem to be pretty fluent and know the resources on autism spectrum. So that's a good thing. I've just popped and will pop in a couple of additional resources into the chat box. Scott had mentioned that we have a neurodiversity toolkit, so I put that in. But let me now, first of all, let me just talk about some of the free resources that we put together specifically for this event. So first of all, if you aren't familiar, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, where both Scott and I work, we conduct research, identify evidence-based practices, and promote these practices to increase the employment of people with disabilities. So ODEP funds a couple of technical assistance centers that Scott had spoken about. But I think one of the most relevant today is really the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. And JAN provides one-on-one consulting for accommodations for people on the autism spectrum. And they also have a comprehensive website with several autism spectrum related resources, including a role play video regarding interviewing a person with a disability. So say for instance, you are looking to create a program for people on the autism spectrum, and you're in that hiring process and you're not quite sure what you can ask, what you can't ask, how to approach the interview and such. Call Jan, and one of their consultants will discuss with you exactly how to approach that. How the disclosure goes, what kind of accommodations may or may not work. And again, there's the sample video there. Because what you're going to find is that the typical interview video, the typical interview process that we use to hire people oftentimes is not the best for people on the autism spectrum. So it may be very challenging and it may be a very stilted interview and you may not know what's going on. So again, if you are looking at hiring people with autism spectrum, you may want to think about changing your interviewing process up, or even just to be knowledgeable enough that when a person is very direct in their answers, that you do not take it the wrong way, that you really understand that they are answering your question probably more directly than most people in an interview. And again, it's just sort of something with the autism spectrum that people have, that, I mean, they're just, people are going to be very honest and direct about the answers. So just kind of expect that. So ODEP also funds the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. So, and among the earned resources on the autism spectrum is the Neurodiversity Workplace Toolkit, which I put the link in your chat box. And there's good information there about interviewing, measuring performance, and providing accommodations to people who are neurodiverse, including people on the autism spectrum. Because just because you're neurodiverse doesn't necessarily mean you are on the autism spectrum. That's really important to be clear on. So next, let's just talk about the Autism at Work Playbook. And that was developed in collaboration with the University of Washington Information School. The Autism at Work Playbook provides guidance on recruitment, program resourcing, interviewing and training and onboarding and retention of people on the autism spectrum. So just know that is a good playbook for you if you're wanting to create such a program, an affirmative action program specifically for people on the autism spectrum. And that too is a really good resource for you. And next, let's talk about Next for Autism, right? So Next for Autism, which is hosting our event today, works to transform the national landscape of services for people on the autism spectrum by strategically designing, launching, and supportive innovative programs. So another great resource for you to tap, another great free resource for you to tap to really get contextual information that you need to create your own program. And then last, of course, is the ADA National Network. So if you have questions specifically about the ADA or more legalistic questions, then do tap your regional ADA national network. There's a national network, but then every region has an ADA network affiliate. So, and you know, one of the things that when I've looked on their sites, that they've published a policy brief on individuals with autism spectrum disorder and employment application of the ADA in terms of Title I. So I know I've gone over these resources pretty quickly, but please do download the handout with all of the links that we spoke of. And that's easily accessible right there within the framework of this webcast. You can just download that handout. So at this point, Lauren, if you want to just read over our contact information for everyone in case they do have questions, and then we'll individual questions that you can certainly send to us. But then also we'll open it up for questions, and we've received a few of those already, so that's good. We can get started.
We actually have one more slide, and then I will do that.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. All right, so, but I will touch on what can you do? What are your next steps? Where do you start? So, and I wanted to say, I think the first place to start is you need to reflect on your corporate culture. You need to understand what your company's currently doing and what you're doing well, and where you see that you can improve on. Are your hiring practices inclusive for the autistic applicants? Are you running self-ID campaigns to show that you're invested in your current employees and where they are in their journey? Are you making sure all of your employees are feeling valued for who they are? Are they able to bring their true selves to work every day? Or are they just coming and punching the clock and doing their work and leaving? And so you really want to reflect on all of this to say, is my culture inclusive? And if you are saying no to any of these, that's where you can see where you can start making improvements so that you're a more inclusive culture. And it also can be, are your jobs universally designed so that everyone can do them at the same level? So again, lots of different ways, lots of different starting points, but that's a really strong starting point to say, hey, is this something that we can currently do? And if not, what do we need to do to improve our culture to make sure that we can?
Moving forward a little bit, you know, and I think that one aspect, there's a couple things. Lou mentioned it, and I know Lauren has as well. It's not, a lot of times we get wrapped up in this whole idea of, okay, we're going to go and recruit. The reality is there are professionals similar with Scott's stories in our companies all the time. The diagnosis rate that Lauren provided was for children. I mean, it's really hard to get your arms wrapped around what a diagnosis rate is for adults. And the more and more adults, the diagnosis, we're becoming more and more aware of what that might manifest itself. So it's not only about recruiting, but it's also about retaining. Scott's role. I mean, okay, yes, he works at ODEP and in theory should have all the accommodation support he possibly needs. But Scott's in a unique role there. But there are also people who are being diagnosed with this that may or may not disclose to you later. But what do you do? And all those supports that Scott talked about come into play. But back to Lauren's point, though, it's really sitting back. Once I have my culture figured out, the other part is we have to actually take what we know about autism. And again, it's a broad spectrum, but not try and insert ourselves into that person's shoes. To sit there and say, well, I don't know how they're possibly going to be able to do that job. That's not our role. Our role is to say, to Scott's point, it's what are your skills, and do your skills meet the needs of the job versus, well, I just don't know how you're possibly going to be able to do that. We get caught up in that. And so, we really need to start examining that process of what it looks like from somebody else's perspective. And one of the easiest ways of doing it is to really start. What does it take? And I used to be the director of recruitment for AMC Theaters, and we referred to it as a kind of a buy the ticket exercise. It's like from the time you roll up to our big, beautiful theaters, what's your experience like before you actually leave our theater as well? And so being able to sit back and say, okay, as an employee, what does it take to actually apply? We have these wonderful applicant tracking systems that are out there. Those in themselves may be a barrier for people, and to tap into what Lou was talking about. Many of the applicant tracking systems is not just a matter of anymore of just collecting your personal data. A lot of times we have assessments that are tied to them. Well, are those assessments able to be passed by people with neurodiversity? Or are we actually screening out the very talent we're trying to bring in? I will say, more often than not, we find that if we're going after neurodiverse talent, and those assessments will screen out somebody, and you may not even be able an opportunity to see them. So one of the things I would say about that is make sure that's not an end all to be all, to where people can make it or not based upon the assessment. There's different ways to assess people. And then Lou mentioned the interview. Well, what does that look like? I mean, if I'm talking to somebody, neurodiverse, these are the same questions we ask everybody, and my HR cousins on the call, it's like, okay, we have standardized interviews. You ask the same interviews to everybody. Okay, can we talk about that for a second? So Lou alluded to the potential of behavior-based interviews. Behavior-based interviews are great, but the reality is it's a game, right? I mean, the idea is you have to answer it a certain way, maybe not the honest way, but we're answer it a certain way to be able to get you on to move on to the next space, right? So let's take, for instance, if you find $20 on the floor, what are you going to do? And that, the question is, if you found $20 on the floor, what would you do with it? Okay. Well, we all probably, a lot of us on the call probably sit there and say, I know what that answer is. But we asked 9 individuals out of 10 that same question, or we asked 10 interviews, 9 out of 10 answered the same way, saying that they would put in their pocket. Those 9 individuals were individuals on autistic talent. So we are like, wait a second, that doesn't make, I mean, it makes sense because it's a very honest answer, but it would not actually get them the job. And so we kind of deconstructed it. What is it that we were actually asking? And it's more of, if we train you in a certain way, are you willing to do what we say and what we train you to do by giving it to somebody, a supervisor or whatever? And they're like, yes. Okay, well, now we can move on. So those behavior-based questions, although in theory they're great, they're also in their own themselves a barrier to employment. So what's the interview process look like? And but then what's the training? The training. Okay, so we have people on the call. So some of you may or may not be taking notes. So what I want you to do right now is to draw a star. And we can't see you, we can't hear you, but I need you to do me a favor and draw a star on a piece of paper. Okay, time's up. Shouldn't be that difficult, right? So I'm assuming, because this is laid out many times, that you've drawn some sort of 5-pointed star or some sort of thing that resembles something in our cosmosphere, and that sort of stuff at start. Well, we actually had an individual who is autistic talent actually draw Lady Gaga. I said the exact same thing. We all heard the same thing, and I made assumptions about what you were going to do with that. However, Lady Gaga pops up, and you go, you know what? You did exactly what it is I asked. It's how we perceive. How do we listen? What's our process? And so with that, when we're talking training, this is, to Lou's point, and even Lauren's, the idea of training and being empathetic and flexible. How do we know when people are actually getting what we're asking and in the way we want them to get it, right? You have to ask questions. So our trainers have probably been training in a lot the same way time and time again, and in reality have probably fallen into a script mode. I say the same thing to somebody and then they get it. Well, neurodiverse talent will hear you. They may process it different, and you just need to check in with them on how they're processing and how they actually truly are learning. But then we also talk about performance management. Again, it goes back to, do you understand what I'm saying? Is it, we need to have a behavior change, or do we need to have, some additional supports, or even asking, what do you need to be successful in your job is a big component. And sometimes they may not even know. Right? It's just like, this is hard. This is not working well. To Scott's point, are they, is it noise canceling headphones? If they need to bring their world, smaller, or kind of desensitize their world, okay. I've actually seen people wear sunglasses. I've seen individuals, who have autism. I've seen people who actually want smaller cubes to work in because these really big cubes are really low walls. They get too much sensory overload. So they want smaller cubes, higher walls, and noise canceling headphones. I mean, just everything they can to desensitize their work area. And you have to be kind of like, okay, I got it. I understand. This is what you need to be successful. So really kind of examining that process is your supports, your hiring protocols that you have in place are certainly, huge in that area. But on the other hand, the biggest thing is to start, right? I mean, and maybe it's just after we talk about our corporate culture, let's commit. Let's say we're going to do something. Maybe do our policies even reflect neurodiversity or diversity and with disability? I mean, who are we? Do we, or is it just our boilerplate? We got to make it sure the EEOC is taken care of. Well, commit to actually saying we want to go and do something. I think, our first part was, our first poll was 50-50. Some of us are actively going after autistic talent, but are we actually reflecting that in who we are? And those of us who are not, you kind of need to put it out there that that's kind of where you're wanting to go, and develop processes and go through this exercise. And if you don't know how to do it yourself, any one of us on this call, Next for Autism, Inclusion Works, ODEP, there's lots of resources. There's people who are willing to stand by and help coach you in that as well. So one thing that when we have been talking, and I'll speak for the other panelists as well, is that it's a pretty short mantra, right? It's the same jobs, same pay with same expectations. None of us are advocating, hey, job carve, only take half a job and give somebody the same pay as everybody else. It's like, give people legitimate shots at competitive employment. There are other places out there and other facilities where people may, have different types of employment, but we advocate neurodiversity in the competitive workspace. So same job, same pay, and same expectations. And with that, I know that the other panelists probably have some other things, but I know that we also have some questions. So Lauren, turn it back over to you, or Lou.
You know what, I just kind of, if Lauren, if you don't mind, I just wanted to mention a couple of things too. So Andy was talking about all of these processes, right? So I think it's really along the way, you know, you're recruiting, you're hiring, you're managing. And I think it's just really essential at each of those touch points too, that you make sure that people were trained, that they are then as familiar as you are with your efforts and the information they need to act appropriately with somebody, so that they know that they're not being challenged. You know, one of my favorite stories was Randy Lewis, who started much of the inclusion programs over at Walgreens. And he has an autistic son. And, you know, it's sort of like this traditional interview where you show up and you have a file, the hiring manager has a file, and you have resume and you have all this information, right? And then you have the person sitting next to you. And then the first question is, tell me a little bit about yourself, you know? And I think Randy's story is that his son would just point to the file and say, it's all right there. I mean, why would you ask me that? You have this complete file. There's 10 sheets of paper there with everything about my life, you know? So you just have to understand that it's gonna be different, that there's different perceptions of what you're asking for. So you may wanna phrase it a little bit differently or be more explicit in really what you're asking the person to do, you know? Hey, I have all this information on you, and I have your resume, and I know what your experiences are, but really what I want to do is hear it from you, right? I mean, that's like that, and that's just a slight change, but that's a lot different than saying you're leafing through this file, you know, and as many hiring managers, you're looking at it the moment that you're interviewing the person. You have no time in advance even to look at it. And then just asking the person to tell me about yourself. It's, you know, to somebody like Randy's son, it's illogical. Like, why would you collect all of this information on me, have it available in advance, and then you're asking me to tell you what's on the paper? What sense is that? You know? So
yeah,
what I'm just expressing is these touch points. You have to train people that people may, it's going to be just a little bit different. And what do I do if it is different? You know, what is my response?
No, and I completely agree with you that, you know, I think training of, I mean, first of all, before you hang out your shingle to say, hey, we're recruiting, you do need to have that training, and different levels and different touch points need different types of training. You know, you know, if I'm just part of a company and I may or may not have any direct working relations with the talent we're going to go seek, I should at least know, you know, what does that look like? I mean, hey, I've told several jokes and they take me so seriously. I just don't understand, right? I mean, there's that aspect. But on to your point, Lou, about the interviews. I've been trained on how to interview, right? That's going to be a boilerplate. Managers all know how to interview. Do you know how to handle diverse talent? Do you know how to pivot when you realize that individual may not be engaging you like everybody else? I mean, to the point to they've never made eye contact with me. I don't know how many managers I've actually sat there and said, that's just a, you know, that's just a no-go for me. Can't make eye contact, can't engage. And it's like, whoa, hold on a second. That may be very much part of, you know, that's a signal to where you might need to adjust your expectations. Not that they can't do the job, but your expectations of how they're going to answer things. And I think that is a huge part. But then the managers, because you got the recruiters. The recruiters are going to pass the person on to their working manager. Now, how does that manager work with that individual? And you know, and I know, Scott, in your story, you talked about managers that, you know, you in your career. There's managers who engaged you, and then there's other managers who are like, I just don't know what to do with. So I think that's a huge part. But getting people trained and comfortable and nimble and flexible versus our rigid perceptions is a huge part of any organization trying to recruit and retain neurodiverse talent, especially people with autism.
Another tip I might just offer too is make sure that you have a functional accommodation process and an infrastructure in place, because oftentimes we think we do. What I always suggest is doing a secret shopper. You know, submit an accommodation and see how long it takes, who it flows through, and whether the information actually lands where it needs to land in order for people to do what they need to do. I think that's a really great approach in terms of accommodations. Because again, whether it's people with disabilities or specifically people on the autism spectrum, they're very well. I mean, there may not be accommodations, right? It may be just subtle changes in the environment. It may not be anything significant at all, but there might be accommodations that you need to put in place. And in which case, you need a functional accommodation process. So you need that to happen fast. You need the person to be effective right away. You certainly don't want to bring people in and they want, it's very negative for the environment if that person's not productive from day one. They want to be productive from day one. We all do when we want to get a new job. But the problem is that you may not have a functional accommodation process, and they may not have the accommodations they need for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it's not a good situation for anyone if those accommodations aren't put in place, as they're needed to be while that person is working. So I think that's another really important tip. So do that secret shopper technique and just send an accommodation through and really see how it flows, how quickly it flows, and how the process works.
I've had this slide up. So I hope that if anyone wants our contact information, you were able to write this down. But here is our contact information. It's all of our email addresses. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us. We can help you out in any way we can. And we are at time. So what we will do is any questions that have been submitted to us, we will get back to you by the end of the week with answers to your questions. And I apologize for not being able to answer them live, but hopefully we'll be able to answer them very, very quickly and soon. So thank you so much for joining us today. And does anybody else have anything else they want to say before I end it? No? All right, well, thank you,
Thanks for the
everyone.
opportunity. Appreciate it.
I just wanted to say, just really briefly, that just to highlight, as Lou mentioned, that a lot of what we shared can empower people in general in terms of the workplace. So a lot of these things just have a universal application to them. So keep that in mind with supports and empowerment of folks, that it can benefit all of your workers to be empowering neurodivergent folks, including autistic workers.
And Lauren, could you tell people, one of the questions we got is how to get the slides, the slide deck?
So what will happen is we will post this on this video. We'll have it available for everyone. We'll email the link out to everyone. There'll be a link to the attachment as well. So that way everybody who is, if you're unable to download or if you're watching this recorded, you'll be able to download the handout as well. So the slide deck will not be going out, but you can always have access to the presentation as a whole. So thank you so much. That's a great question. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, all.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
thank you.
Bye.